Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space. And as always, I hope that you enjoy. Story number 1. Man on a Mission, written by Lbry Father Anthracite. Steve was annoyed. He had gotten the spaceball 3 hours early. He had checked the itinerary. He had checked the boarding regulations on the datanets. And yet, he was now being informed that he was not allowed to bring open containers of water onto the shuttle. He started directly into the photoreceptors of the guard. "It's water. I need it to live. It's a solvent. You can't bring open bottles of it on board," said the guard with a kind of bored deadpan of put-on security guards everywhere. Steve picked up the bottle and without breaking eye contact, drained the whole thing in one go, swallowing as loudly as he could. Once he was done, the guard, with no change of expression or tone, said, "Have a nice trip," and stepped out of the way. Steve barely managed to contain the string of vulgarities that he wanted to scream at the guard, grabbed his bags and walked towards the gate without another word. He started breathing exercises to calm down as he walked through the concourse. Now was not the time to cause problems. He was on a mission. After getting to the gate, Steve prepared his paperwork for boarding and double-checked with the attendant that the gate was correct and no changes had been made. Once he was sure that he was in the right place with the right paperwork, he sat on a round, backless couch. He set his bags between his feet and pulled out a book that he had gotten. He had gone with an actual paperback so that he wouldn't have to worry about disabling it during flights or transfers. He sat and read quietly for a while as other passengers came up to the gate. A small child covered in short fur came over and stared at Steve for a while. When Steve noticed the kid looking at his book, he smiled and turned it to show the child the English characters printed on the page. He was telling the kid about the spy story in the book when one of its parents came up. "Batchna, sorry, was preparing, did not mean trouble." "No, Batch, I was showing off my book. Have a good trip." Steve waved to the tiny furball as it got carried off. It waved back at Steve. Checking the time, Steve gathered his things and headed to the gate, where a line had started to form. He was fifth in the line. A few minutes later, the attendant, an iridescent blue insectoid, began boarding passengers. When it was Steve's turn, he handed over his paperwork, which was efficiently processed by the attendant. The paperwork was handed back with a cheerful, chittering noise. Steve took a deep breath and with some effort responded with the same noises. The attendant waved his antennae in appreciation, and the attendant waved to Steve as he started to move towards the shuttle. Steve found his seat, stowed his bags, and strapped himself in as best he could. 3-point harness and soft black couches were as close to the shuttle and had 2 human seats. He lay flat, strapped to the couch, and waited. He felt the anxiety rising in him as the launch approached. Another attendant, one of the furried aliens, came and checked that Steve was as secure as possible. Steve gave a thumbs up, and the attendant moved on. Steve was moving gracefully down the corridor in 0G. He had thankfully survived the ascent and made it to interstellar ship, where he would spend the next week. He was currently heading towards his berth. Gravity fields would be applied once the ship was beyond the gravity well of the planet below. But parking orbit was close enough for artificial gravities to interact with planet's natural gravity and cause issues. Steve found his berth and was unlocking the door when he felt something clamp onto his leg. Looking down, he saw the little furry alien child wrapping its arms around his leg. "Chummy, where's your family, little one?" He looked in the direction of the child pointed and saw the parents hurrying up the corridor, looking slightly panicked. Steve smiled and waved. The parents that he had spoken to previously apologized again, but Steve told them not to worry. He patted the little one on the head and promised to play with it after the ship was underway. The furried family thanked him and continued down the corridor. Steve got his door opened and headed into the berth. Steve handed the child a sheet of paper on which he had just written the English alphabet and said, "Let's try that one more time, okay?" They then began to sing the alphabet song as the child pointed to the letters, one after another. In a nearby seat, one of the child's parents trilled happily as it listened. "Awesome, buddy. Be sure to show your parents tonight, okay? Goodbye, Mr. Stevie." it said, and toddled off towards its parents. Steve waved at the parent with a smile, and the child began talking about the letters that it had learned today. Steve reached into a pocket and pulled out the spy novel that he'd been reading. When the child had found him again, it had latched onto his leg and asked if they could play. Steve had spent some time teaching it the alphabet song as a welcome diversion. There were only a couple days left until the ship arrived. Steve sat in the lounge and finished his novel, having only a handful of pages left. Once he had finished, he decided to get some food, then headed to the commissionery. Steve smiled wide as the tiny furry child sat on his shoulders, and he had an arm around each of its parents. The attendant took a couple snapshots with compads and handed them back to Steve and the family. They had exchanged netmail addresses, and Steve had promised the little one that he would check in soon to see how his alphabet was coming along. After saying goodbye, Steve headed towards the pickup area at the spaceport and signaled for a cab. After typing in his destination, the autopilot gently accelerated. Steve dug through his bag and found a small wooden box. He had traveled many light years to get his hands on its contents. He hadn't been home in nearly 2 months, and now 15 minutes in a cab was all that stood in his way. Steve stood outside the door, his bags propped against the wall, temporarily forgotten. He could feel the corners of the box dig into his hand as he clenched it nervously. He rang the bell. After a few moments, it swung open, and a tall, slender alien with leaves laid flat against its head opened the door. She looked surprised and happy. "Stephen, you're home 2 days early." She threw her arms around his neck, and he wrapped his around her waist. They hugged tightly, and Steve kissed her cheek. He finally let her go, and she took a step back and held the door for him. "Shania, my love, I have something to tell you," he said, not moving. "What is it?" she asked, a little confused. "I wasn't at training seminar for work. I was in Humanity. I got this." He held up a little box and lifted the lid. Inside was a small, faintly luminescent seed. Shania's eyes narrowed, then got wide as she looked at him in a minuscule object and realized what it meant. She gingerly closed the lid, and then, once she was sure that it was secured, slammed into Steve, her arms wrapping around him as she squeezed as tight as she could. He could feel her sticky tears on his cheek as she whispered "yes" into his ear. He squeezed her back just as hard, and she felt his watery tears on her neck. He whispered, "I love you." End of story. Story number 2. They See, written by Algae Father Anthracite. Humans scare me. Not because of their fighting ability, their surprising strength, or even the fact that they are harder to kill than an armored Schnerkleck. They scared me because they are so observant. I know what you're thinking. What is so scary about being observant? Humans watch everything. They watch how people talk to each other, who avoids who. They watch how people move. Body language, they call it. They say humans are better observing alien body language than any other known species. Humans could convey more with a few gestures and facial expressions than most species even realize. I've seen whole conversations happen without a single spoken word. I had been unaware of this for many yarnums, until a colleague pointed it out to me. I just assumed that looking at each other was a human thing, like their smile. I never imagined that so much could be conveyed so silently. Humanity's long association with multiple dependent species, such as cats and dogs, had given them an innate ability to learn foreign body language. Since they were such social creatures, they were just as capable with group dynamics as well. As with all species, there are those with more skill at this than others. I remember the first time I noticed a human actively observing others. It was at a gathering. There was an informal meet-up with several diplomatic corps from several species. I sat on the edge of the gathering, quietly watching how the groups interacted with each other. He took notes on a small pad. He saw me from across the room and smiled a little and waved me over. After introducing himself, he pointed out some of his observations. How the ambassador of one party was facing away from his counterpart, despite being in a conversation. He said this indicated that they were only professionally friendly, but didn't actually like one another. He pointed out another couple of ambassadors who were, at least according to him, actually good friends. He showed me how the whole delegation was basically avoiding interacting with anyone except to make basic greetings. As the party progressed, he pointed out interactions between various members of the delegations. These interactions were what he was there to watch for. He said they would make it easier to make contact through back channels, knowing who was friends with whom, and who could whisper in the ear of powerful people. He told me that how he was just good at reading people's interactions. He said there were specialists who studied every species-specific body language, how they would pore over recordings of important people until they could tell at a glance if someone was lying or not. Even if it was a lie, it was a terrifying idea that someone could give away so much without even realizing it. To humans, we are just prey to be observed, and that is why I fear them. End of story. Just a quick shout out to the T5 peeps: Bob the Dragon, Cat Crab Lobster, Data Magnet, Dark Machine, Bezic, Try Again 95, Pudic Yol, Astrea the Dreamer, Caspar Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Athelia, Meridian 117, and Jordan Bucksmorm. Thank you very much. And that, my friends, concludes this video. I hope that you enjoyed. There are links down below, both to support this channel and for the author of this fiction. Anyways, I hope you all have a fantastic one, and I'll see you next time. Cheers.